So I'll just say welcome to viewers who tuned in for this interview. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce someone who doesn't need much introduction to the Society, and this is Angus Lunn. Hello, Angus.
Hi.
Angus, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's a real pleasure, and not least because I've just seen you, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago on the BBC reporting about Kielder forest, tree plantations and peat bog health. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yes. And am I right in thinking that is that one of your main areas of expertise as a naturalist, and that was the subject of your PhD, was that right?
Broadly speaking, it's more complicated than that.
Do tell us.
Well, can I start at the very beginning?
Yes, do indeed.
And say that when I was very young, probably during the war,
Right.
I had a slightly older friend who had the curious hobby of collecting 1-inch ordnance survey maps.
Right.
And since he was older than me, I thought I would do the same thing. So I started collecting maps with the ambitious aim of covering the whole country, which would never happen, of course. He also, by the way, and this has been quite a big part of my life, got me involved in watching Newcastle United, and I've been doing that ever since.
Excellent.
To my pleasure sometimes and horror at other times. Anyway, the interest in maps almost inevitably led when I was going through grammar school, as it then was, and was applying to university. Geography was what I was aiming to study, and did. But I'd always also been interested in plants. I think that probably began when, again, it must have been during the war, when I was, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, something like that.
Yeah.
And I was allowed to roam over the countryside.
Yeah.
It was fairly safe in those days.
Yeah.
And I chanced upon a glade in a local wood. There was a sheet of bluebells, and I was absolutely gobsmacked by it. Yeah. I think that started it off. So anyway, I retained this interest in plants. There was an inspirational teacher at school teaching A-level biology who fostered the interest. So when I had to specialize within geography, coming back to geography,
Yeah.
I specialized in biogeography. And that's where maps came back into it.
Yes.
Oh yes, there was another influence too. Also at the grammar school, there was a very, very good geography teacher who explained how the pattern of climate over the planet was predictable. If you knew the shape of the continents, you could make a good guess at what climate would be where there'd be Mediterranean climate, where there'd be tropical, moist, and so on. Yeah. And from that, you could predict where vegetation would be in the different biomes. And I realized that there were patterns, and that patterns told you something.
Yeah.
So the combination of maps and patterns and my interest in plants meant biogeography.
Wow.
Which is what I specialized in at university.
Mhm.
And when I came on to sign on for a PhD thesis,
Mhm.
likewise, maps, plants, patterns, mapping vegetation.
Yeah.
And it's mapping vegetation, coming back to your question,
Yeah.
that led me into these peat bogs in the border country. It's when
Right.
I discovered how important they were, and in due course was able to be involved in helping to conserve them.
Yes.
So
Amazing. So
that's that's the story.
it's a brilliant one. It's interesting, isn't it, how important, you know, those individuals, those teachers, those friends can be in introducing us to aspects of the natural world, and enthusiasms, and just sort of opening our eyes to what's possible in terms of, you know, of things to get involved in, but also to then sort of push forward as well.
There's nothing to match an inspirational teacher.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, when you started, when you were doing when you're at university and then going on to your PhD,
Yeah.
was biogeography, was it quite a small subject, a small world at that time?
Oh yes, indeed it was at that time. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so when did you first get involved with the natural history, the society?
Right. When I graduated with my PhD, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to apply to universities uh, for a job. Um, so I applied to various places, and the first place I both applied to and actually got the job by sheer coincidence was Newcastle,
Hey.
where I'd been all the time, as it were. And I don't know how much you know about extramural departments. Uh, no?
Not much. Well, I think essentially, you know, that it used to be, my sense of it was that it used to be an important part of the university's activity, but maybe less so in the current day.
Yes. Almost every university had what was then called an extramural department that later became adult education or continuing education. Um, and civic universities like Newcastle thought it was especially important in maintaining their connection with the region. Um, so as it so just by chance, the first job I got was in the extramural department at what was then still King's College, University of Durham. And
What year was that, Angus? Do you remember?
it would be 1958.
58. That's right. Because is it 1962 that, or one that it became Newcastle University? I think
63, I think it
63.
was.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
I should know. I'm a historian.
yes, so your question was how I became involved with the Natural History Society.
That's
Right. I was appointed as, what was it? The Extension Lecturer in Science.
right. Okay.
Which I understood to mean natural science. I'd always been interested in geology as well as biology. And so that is what I started teaching adult groups at supposedly university level. They had to do written work in those days. And the area that Newcastle was responsible for was Northumberland, Newcastle North Tyneside, Cumberland and Westmoreland.
Right. Quite a range.
So in one of my earliest commitments was to drive over every week to Workington on the west coast of Cumbria to talk to a group about whatever the subject happened to be. And for a long time, you know, I was involved in teaching in Cumbria, as it now is, Cumberland and Westmont, as it then was,
Yes.
driving over from Newcastle. In the early days, being allowed to spend a hotel overnight before traveling home. But later I couldn't be bothered and just drove home late at night, you know, so
Yeah.
it was very bad for the planet, all this driving around, obviously. Sorry, what was, back to the question.
Back
What was the question again?
your first involvement with the society.
Oh, yes, right. Yeah, given that my job was outreach to the public, I was firmly told by the head of the department, you must join local societies.
Right.
That's how I first became involved with the Natural History Society. I don't know when it was, it must have been 59, 60-ish, something like that,
Wow.
when Grace Hickling was firmly in charge. And apart from the Natural History Society, I also got involved from the very beginning with the Northumberland Wildlife Trust.
Right. Okay. Yes.
I was at their inaugural meeting in 1962, and I was soon drafted onto the Wildlife Trust's council. It was called the Northumberland and Durham Naturalist Trust
Right.
in those days. And I've been involved with both it and the society ever since.
That's astonishing. That's decades of service on both, isn't it? I mean, our current director calculated that you've been not just involved, but a trustee of NHSN for 39 years, which is, I mean, over that time, Angus, I mean, what are the big changes that you've seen, you know, either in maybe how the public sees the natural world, or you know, what impact those societies may have had on the natural world?
I think that's for someone else to say, quite honestly. Clearly, television has done far more to involve the public, I would have thought,
Yes.
in Edinburgh and the others, than local societies. Local societies have helped, obviously. And the fact that there was both a wildlife trust and a natural history society with different objectives has certainly helped to involve more people.
Yes. Yes. And do you think, I mean, I mean, over your lifetime and involvement and expertise, do you think the challenges for the natural world have increased, or do you feel optimistic about that?
Oh, they've increased enormously. Do I feel optimistic with the present government? I think I feel slightly more optimistic after Joe Biden has made the announcements he's been making in the last week or two,
Right.
about how seriously he intends the United States to take matters.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I suppose from your perspective, that we've still got a long way to go before we can be truly optimistic about how we're treating our environment.
Yeah. When my wife and I used to go on holiday, say in the Scottish Highlands,
Yeah.
you had to stop every few miles to wipe spattered insects off the car windscreen, you know.
Yes.
Now you can drive all day with a clean windscreen.
Yeah.
Of all the insects gone.
Yes. Yes. It's true. I mean, hopefully, I suppose.
What?
Sorry, go ahead.
I've got company.
I know, I see. Lovely. It's good to see some wildlife take part in these interviews.
Yeah.
It's that is you know, it's an interesting perspective, and going back to your first job as as extramural lecturer, and you know, getting involved, trying to get people involved in natural history, geography, geology. I mean, as you say, we have different media now to get those messages out, but I wonder, you know, are people just getting out themselves into the natural world enough? And maybe that would be, you know, that would be part of a more optimistic future potentially.
Well, the society is certainly thriving. You know, numbers have been growing. The participation in the educational program, I think, is marvelous. It's magnificent.
Yeah, yeah. And for those, maybe for those members or members of the public who are interested in getting into natural history, I mean, would you have any kind of top tips, as it were, about how, if someone was interested in getting involved and learning more, what would you advise them to do?
Join the society, eh? Or, well, same thing, join the society and attend one of its educational courses.
Yeah, yeah.
Attend the field meetings.
Yeah, yeah, and learn. Yeah. Well, I wonder if we can go back to your work on around Kielder and the peat bogs.
Yeah.
And get a sense of from you where that started from your own research and your PhD study, and how that's continued over the years.
Well, I was mapping vegetation in a large chunk of West Northumberland. I walked a lot.
Right.
I walked an enormous amount.
Okay.
I had to walk over every hectare of ground in a large area of moorland. And after a week of that, perhaps staying in a youth hostel, in fact, exactly staying in a youth hostel, I used to long for a big brassy city just to relax. However, no, I produced, in effect, moorland vegetation maps, detected patterns, but also realized that the sphagnum-dominated bogs I was mapping were rather special. And I submitted the maps for my PhD thesis and almost forgot about them for 2 or 3 years, until the Wildlife Trust came into existence. And in those days, the main objective was to acquire nature reserves as rapidly as possible. You know, so huge were the pressures upon the environment,
Yeah.
that we felt the only way to have any effect was actually to own sites, or at least to have long lists on them. So that reminded me of the border mires, which is what I christened them. And I persuaded the Wildlife Trust that it ought to get in touch with the Forestry Mission to try to prevent as many as possible from being planted up, because they were being drained and planted. The trust agreed, and I produced a list of what I thought were the better sites, and we submitted that to the Forestry Mission. Now, this was in the unreformed days of the Forest Commission,
Yeah.
when they were single-minded planters of spruce.
Yeah.
And they looked at the list of sites and said, all right, we will not plant 8 of the sites that I put forward, but you must pay us a rent based on the timber foregone, the income foregone from losing the output of those sites.
Yeah.
That's unimaginable today, but
Yeah.
that was what happened. It must have been, it was in the early 1970s.
Right.
So we were able to declare 8 of these border mires as nature reserves, in fact, leased from the Forest Commission. And 1971, which is exactly 50 years ago, is when we carried out the first conservation work on a border mire. Volunteers with spades putting peat back into dams that had just been dug,
Right.
to bug up the grips, burn up the drains. You know?
Yeah.
So it's the 50th anniversary this year,
Amazing.
which is quite nice.
Yes, I'll say. I mean, do you think it's interesting what you say about the unreformed Forestry Commission? And I mean, do you think that attitudes have changed now?
Oh, absolutely, yes. It's now a multifunctional organization. They do a huge amount for nature conservation. I'm not saying they couldn't do more, but they are doing a huge amount.
Yes, but you know, it must be, you know, due to your work, the work of your colleagues, raising awareness and pushing for all those years, you know, and actually spade to soil
Across the country, yeah.
To, you know, to make that change.
Yep.
Yes, yes. I mean, looking back across such a, you know, a varied career and sort of passion for the natural world, is that what stands out, or what would you see as the highlight, really, or your biggest achievement over those years?
Coming back to Cumbria,
yeah,
in the Lake District, it was almost a perk of the job having to do adult education in the Lake District.
Yeah.
And for many years, I had a class in Keswick. I used to drive over to Keswick once a week and drive home again. And I also got involved in running residential field courses in the Lake District, in various centres. Now, it so happened that one extramural department, as well as having full-time staff, employed part-time staff, experts in their particular subjects, many of whom were university departments. However, one of the part-time staff that we employed in Cumbria was a clergyman, Canon Harvey. And he took his religion very lightly. He was an old-fashioned clergyman naturalist.
Yes.
And he and I used to run courses jointly in the Lake District. I would deal with the geology, he would deal with the birds and the insects, and we would share the plants between us. Okay. And that went on for many years. But in particular, it was through Canon Harvey that I got involved in mountain plants. Helvellyn was his special mountain.
Right.
And he and I climbed Helvellyn often together. It's the richest Lake District mountain for mountain plants, for alpine plants.
Right.
And we used to take parties there too, sometimes wearing hard hats, sometimes not. So that's what triggered a long-term interest in and mountain plants.
Yeah.
Oh, a story. We use various residential centres in the Lake District.
Yeah.
And one year, we, by which I mean the department, got a message from what was then still Cumberland, not Cumbria County Council, that they acquired a new property on the shores of Derwentwater, Keswick, called Hall's End, and would be interested in using that. So I went across to suss it out, and in chatting to the newly appointed warden, said there's a shed in the grounds which is being used for chickens, to keep chickens in.
Right.
It's deep in chicken shit, but underneath appear to be books. Would you care to have a look? So I did, and was rather impressed with what I saw. So I got a friend who was one of the librarians in Newcastle, the university librarians,
Yes,
to come across. And I also involved my wife, who was the departmental librarian by that time. And the three of us began to excavate this library. And it was absolutely fantastic. The house had belonged to the son of a wealthy Yorkshire industrialist,
right.
called Marshall, Frank Marshall. And he had amassed this library, but the house during the war had been requisitioned for some sort of convalescent centre.
Right.
And they just chucked the books into a shed, which subsequently had been used for keep chickens. But anyhow, a deal was done with Cumberland County Council that since we were doing the donkey work, the loot would be shared between Cumberland Archives, Newcastle University Library, and our departmental library. So, for example, all the local stuff would go to Cumberland.
Yeah.
I can't quite remember the split between us and the university library.
Yes.
But as a reward for actually finding the stuff and excavating it, I was allowed to keep 2 or 3 volumes, as it were. So I acquired first edition of Charles Darwin, not the Origin of Species, I'm sad to say, but his vegetable mold and earthworms, which I treasure. Alfred Russel Wallace's Island Life.
Wow.
Charles Lyell's Elements of Geology. And most important of all to me, a book you won't have heard of, James Croll, Croll, a Scot, called Climate and Time, published in 1875, which was the original solution to why the Earth had flipped between glaciations and interglacials, based on his astronomical work.
Amazing.
And is now regarded as a Bible among quaternary scientists. So anyhow, that was part of the story. The rest of the story is the daughter of this deceased Frank Marshall was called Catherine Marshall, and she was a prominent suffragette. So we found a suffragette banner under this chicken muck.
Wonderful.
We found correspondence between Catherine Marshall and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, all of which, of course, went to Cumberland Archives. And Catherine Marshall had got herself involved in every progressive cause in the 1930s you could think of, you know, helping refugees from Nazi Germany, anti-cannibalism, you name a progressive cause, she was involved in it. So that was all great fun.
That's amazing. Imagine, oh, it's what historians dream of, is coming across a shed filled with treasures.
Yes.
That's amazing. And is that outdoor centre still operational, or is it?
I don't know. I don't know.
No. But it must have been transformational for so many people who were able to use it and learn at it and undertake courses.
Yeah, well, we use that and various other centres. We used Branchwood, which was Ruskin's old home for many years.
Yes.
So it was a perk of my job being able to enjoy the Lake District. Now you do enjoy the Lake District.
Yes,
yeah.
Indeed, yes. That, yeah, as you say, it's just from talking to you, I'm getting the sense of a life lived outdoors. You know, as much as possible, out walking mires, in the lakes, up mountains.
Yeah, a large part of my childhood was spent on farms, actually.
Right.
Because the village I lived in, my best friend, not the one who collected maps, but my best friend was a farmer's son. So I spent a lot of time knocking around the farm.
Yes.
And then during the war and after the war, my parents packed me off to a cousin of theirs who had a farm. So I spent all my summer holidays on farms, helping in inverted commas.
Yeah.
And I think I'd always envisaged, I think, I would have a job that involved being outdoors a good deal of the time.
Yes. Yes. And so it came to pass.
And it came to pass.
Yeah.
Indirectly, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Angus, for taking us through that, your amazing work and the different people who've inspired you and you've worked with, and the different places. It's an absolute inspiration for us. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.